Thank you for having me here today. I'm going to be talking about urban infill, and as Deborah said, with, not in place of, our historic character. But many people out there would probably just regard me as a heritage heretic, but I actually do residential property development design for my bread and butter. Also, I'm a heritage expert, but it's interesting that my public persona is one of being all for heritage when development is the mainstay of my livelihood, with developments like this, which I've designed and continue to design. But I do practice what I preach, and we bought a local heritage place, and in terms of the topic of my talk today, I did exactly what I'm going to be talking about today with my own house, which is this local heritage listed house. I'd been approached to argue as a heritage consultant why it should be demolished. I said to the architect who approached me, sorry, I wouldn't be able to come up with a plausible argument to support your thing. I then, of course, didn't take the commission. Another heritage consultant who was mentioned earlier today took on the commission and argued that my house should not be listed. So we developed the tennis court. We didn't have to demolish anything, but we built the tennis court. We built those 3 townhouses on the tennis court, and we restored the house, which looked like that. Was argued to be not worthy of listing on account of the front windows having been altered, the porch being in place for the veranda, the front fence not being original, but we restored it with archival photograph evidence back to looking like that. Now, a few years ago, I did looking at this urban consolidation in Elizabeth Street near me, where Norwood heritage architect Mark Butcher did a survey back in 1995, and I looked at how many of those buildings recommended to be contributory items in 1995 that never got listed by the Norwood Council, which was headed up by Helen Dyer, who sat on the recommendation from Mark Butcher to make a historic conservation zone in this part of Norwood for some considerable time, and then Planning SA said that they weren't going to be supporting it, so it never got advanced. And all of those buildings in red, that's just in the Elizabeth Street environs, had been demolished. But I've actually had to update that, and now even more have gone, and it's getting worse. But it's one thing to look at a map like that and think, oh, well, I've made the demolition blood red to show the casualties. But what does that really equate to? That's what we've lost, or about to lose. And what have we gained? That's what we've gained. So from that, look at the top villa, top right, top left, that's what replaced it. That peach-coloured one with all of the trees, that's that Medallion or Lairs homes. In almost every circumstance, it was a one-for-one replacement. So you would have heard Michael Lennon, the former chair of the Planning Commission, saying, if Adelaide is not to spread from Gawler to the southern vales, then we need to allow for urban consolidation and not have heritage restrictions get in the road of urban consolidation. Otherwise, we'll be spreading out like that. That's the argument. I think if he was more honest, he would say, we listen to the volume home building companies who want to be able to knock down houses in the nicest parts of Adelaide, because most of them mean one-for-ones. That one there's a rare example where 2 villas were replaced by that apartment development. But at least we get the fake villas retained, like the one on the right. So the one on the left is gone, and that one on the right's what we're left with. Adelaide's really improving. So it's gone from that, and that's across the road to that, to that. It's all rather depressing. And that's just 200 metres from Stephen Marshall's electoral office. And this house here in Norwood, which we saw, and there's the new house going up in its place. Look at all the trees. And look what became of it. Not one skerrick of vegetation was retained. And demolition companies charge more. But it doesn't need to be that way. This is a development which I designed in 1996, on the corner of Osmond Terrace and William Street, where you can see the claret ash tree, which goes red in autumn, and the liquid amber tree and other trees were all retained and incorporated into the development. And this development, which I designed in about 1998 in Little Archer Street in Kent Town, Little Angus Street, those pepper trees and the cedar trees all could have been demolished had we elected to, but I persuaded my client that the development would be enhanced by the retention of those. But that is the rare exception, and it is not the norm of what we see with new development. But when we're just talking about urban consolidation, you can retain buildings and get the urban consolidation if you try. And I do a lot of work gratis, it seems. And this was one attempt that I made to persuade this developer. So this house, which had been Italianated in the 60s, the little excerpt is a matching villa next to it to show what it could have looked like as it was stored. I put this submission together, showing how they could build something behind and divide it into two, and showing a house was stored there. And there's the proposal to convert it into two dwellings with a dwelling at the back, but I failed, and that's what we now see. And you can see the villa on the left. Had they kept it and restored it, it would have been two villas like that next to each other. So look at the replacement we've got. And even the inducement of... And the Norwood Council plan has said, we will allow you to have a narrower driveway and we will support you dividing the existing house into two if you keep the house. But that wasn't even enough incentive to induce the developer to keep it. That's why you have to have heritage listings, because incentives isn't enough and it won't work, and that's the result. And that house is just about to be demolished. Front door's been removed. It's got bunting around it. So that was sold as a land proposition. The underbidder was a builder who was going to renovate the house, but the successful bidder is going to knock it. But in this instance, I came up with a scheme to do an extra dwelling to one or other side of that building on the corner. But there the planners said that the new house would have too much garaging relative to the percentage frontage, even though I were retaining the actual villa on the corner. So they only looked at it in terms of the frontage of the new dwelling, rather than saying, well, because if you look at the garaging on the top there, that could just be the garaging for the house, and that would be perfectly acceptable. Or the garaging around the corner would be there. So whether the house is there or there, you're going to get a double garage next to the house. But that wasn't supported, and that's where planning controls actually could be finessed. And I think councils would be supportive of having some more flexibility in their planning controls if they could properly protect the historic character that they valued. These are some more sketches of how that could have transpired. And there's the application to demolish and build two McMansions in its place. This is another example in Edward Street, Norwood, where I did a concept to divide the existing house in two. Under the Norwood Council development plan, they had provisions where if you kept the building built, they couldn't stop you demolishing the building, but they said if you keep it, you can divide it into two. Now, under the new planning code, you can't. So you could have divided that into two, but now in the planning code you can't. But they can't stop demolishing the demolition of that, and demolition of that isn't even defined as development. That was a concept sketch I did for that particular one, where the hallway gets given to the side without the driveway, and then if you walk down the driveway you can see at the end of the house an entrance for the northern dwelling, and then you can see there's a double two car spaces, and the northern car park walks behind the next car park to get to there. So that's a typical 50-foot frontage. That's the most typical scenario that you see, and in that would work. And councils, if the code was changed to enable this sort of development on the basis that these houses weren't allowed to be demolished, it's a good way forward. Alternatively, you could provide permit parking for the one that doesn't get the driveway, because not everyone chooses to have a car. If you're living in the inner areas, you can get by without a car, or you're quite happy to park your car out on the street. I've got a nice Audi, and most of the time it's parked on the front. So people aren't necessarily as precious about where they park their car. It's not such a deal breaker to have on-site car parking, and that's another way of providing a bit more affordability in housing if you're providing housing without garaging. This was a concept in Hyde Park. There the planners didn't support this scheme to put another dwelling behind the one next to it, and you can see the house top left in the little sketch. They said it didn't meet the minimum allotment size, didn't meet the frontage width, and that's now just been replaced with one dwelling. So there's another example of where if you change the planning code to allow the flexibility but you didn't give the option to demolish the building, you could get better planning outcomes. There's another example in Unley. This was a contributory item in Marion Street, Unley, off Duthie Street. It has a rear street aspect. The opportunity here to divide the existing villa into two, that was presented as part of the submission, but the people who purchased the property were demolishing it just to build one large house. So again, because unfortunately the Unley Cap agreed because of the structural condition of the building, which I presented evidence of how it could be repaired, but they didn't agree with me and they allowed the demolition. Now they've got the option to demolish, and they're going to demolish because they can. This zoning doesn't allow for that to be divided into two, but had it been allowed to be divided on the basis that you keep the house, you may well have kept that house. And houses like this, under the planning code, in historic area overlays, and this is not in a historic area overlay, you can't demolish a house unless it's been significantly altered. That one's been significantly altered by Italian immigrants in the 1950s. We know lots of houses like that, and houses like that are being demolished all the time. Yet this is a house that I worked on for a client that looked like that had also been similarly compromised, and you can see the transformation of that house and how that could be done. That exercise cost about $100,000 for that house, which I think is quite reasonable in the vicinity of a property of that value. Adelaide's inner historic areas are littered with what I sometimes derisively describe as cream brick shitters, 1950s houses like this that no one would miss. If you can't demolish the pre-World War I or pre-World War II houses, the developers will beeline for these sort of houses instead. Because these are all structurally, they're not about to fall down, that's the sort of property that we should be seeing redeveloped.
Isn't that basket range at point?
Yes, that was, yeah. Now, this is a survey that I undertook off my own back over a sample of Norwood, just to look at the state of clay, which is endemic with all of Adelaide's historic suburbs. And the little bright green area, the top bit there, that's a historic conservation zone. Within those things, the dark green ones are local heritage items, the light green ones are afforded protection because they're in a historic conservation zone. That and the dark green ones with the dots are local heritage items, comprise just 25% of that area. But all of the brown, the dark brown are Victorian pre-1915 housing stock, the light brown are pre-1940 housing stock. Historic character buildings comprise 67 to 70% of the area. So only 25% is actually protected. And the same would go for Prospect and most of the inner historic areas of Adelaide. And it's because Planning SA wouldn't agree to more comprehensive listings. But what the Mayor of Norwood is now looking at doing is expanding its historic area overlays. This is something I've been pushing for, because if you drove around, you'd have trouble picking why that bit's a historic conservation area and not the whole bang lot. And it's often said, and I remember Jason Schulz from Dash saying to me that areas need to have a certain percentage of intactness to be worthy of listing. Well, if 40% of the building are cream brick 1950s housing stocks, well, they can all be redeveloped. Do you throw the baby out with the bathwater just because there's been some incursion of later development? But we're talking about 60 to 70% intactness. And this diagram here, which was put in SA Life one issue, is an illustration of the difference between the historic character houses in Adelaide and the new sort of what perhaps Planning SA or Michael Lennon or Paul Stark might describe as the ones that maintain the character because they've got a hipped roof, but the one on the right, that it equates to that. So you can see the difference in construction. You've got 12-foot ceilings, elevated, sprung floors, thick stone walls, plinths, stretcher courses, all of that detailing compared to that. And you can see it in the construction, the difference. So there's ample opportunity for Adelaide to achieve urban consolidation without losing the historic stone houses that everybody loves about Adelaide. And people living in Sydney and Melbourne thinking about whether they move to Adelaide would actually think about, well, Adelaide's got beautiful stone. I love those old stone houses they have there. That's one of the reasons why I'd like to move there. So we can capitalise on that, and we don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Now, On our main corridors, we talked about development along the corridors and stuff. This is just a couple of examples of where I've designed developments which have been subsequently built, where we've retained historic shop buildings to the street. This was Paynham Road, down from the avenues in St Peter's. There's no nightclub in this development, but there's at-grade parking and 2-storey townhouses there. So that's achieving a density of, there's 10 dwellings on a 900 square metre block there. So it's achieving 100 dwellings per hectare density with a 3-storey development. And speaking with someone at the break, they talk about the viability that, Planning SA, and I remember Stuart Mosley, who's now been appointed to the Planning Commission, said it's got to be 6 storeys to be viable. Well, the viability of development is a product of how much you pay for the land. So if you zone it for 6 story, you're going to put up the price of the land. So of course you've got to do 6 stories to make it viable. But along the corridors, just having a 3-storey allowance allows for that sort of development, and that's far less of an impost on people living adjacent that form of development than a 4, 5, 6-storey development, which is what we're seeing. And the streetscape effect, you're seeing the historic shops to the front main. And this was another development which we did. Above is our computer modelling of the proposal. You might remember Merch Stationery on Kensington Road. That wasn't a historic building, but it may have been. It could have been, but it was the same format with an undercroft car park and 2 levels. So there's 12 apartments, and the upstairs ones all get north light through the factory-style clerestory windows. So that's a form of development that can be done rather than the 4, 5, 6-storey form of development. So we can have our cake and eat it too. Thank you.